We're looking at promises that we can find in the Bible that help us when we're afraid, when we're ashamed, when we're worried, and when we're weary. And we begin with this promise: never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. This verse is first found in the Old Testament. At the end of the wilderness wandering, they're about to enter into the promised land. And they are told that they're going to enter war and conflict. They're going to enter trouble. Moses was handing the reins at the time over to Joshua. And as they prepare to enter the promised land, they are told that there are very powerful forces that will oppose them. And when they hear about these forces, naturally, they feel threatened and they feel frightened. And in the midst of something that triggers fear in them, Moses has some words to say to him, his last speech to them, and it includes these verse, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. He says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. So there's a couple of things. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He addresses their fear. And how he addresses their fear is not to say to them that there aren't things that they will confront. He says to them, in addressing their fear, that when they face these things, they will not face them alone because he will not abandon them. It says he will never leave you. And we talked about this word when we were thinking of this verse from last week, be still and know that I am God. The word be still is the Hebrew word rapha. And what it means is cease striving. Let go, or the physical expression of rapha is to let your arms hang limp at your side. And this is what this word means. It says in the context of be strong and courageous, do not be afraid or ashamed, terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never rapha you. And so here's the suggestion. God will never let his arms hang limp at his side. He goes with you. He will never let his arms go limp, his hands go limp at his side. Since he is going to be with you, you can let your hands hang limp because God will never let his hands go limp. They could let their hands hang limp at their side, not because there was no way to defend themselves, which is why the Israelites assumed this posture. One time they were threatened by a Midianite army they were very overwhelmed. And they just had no way to defend themselves, and so they let their arms hang limp at their side. In this case, they are to let their hands hang limp at their side, not because there's no way to defend themselves, but because there's no need. God will go with them. And that's how he addresses their fear. This is a lesson Jesus had to teach his disciples. It says that day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Then he said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and said and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. They were upset with Jesus because Jesus didn't share their desperation. Don't you care if we drown? When we're in trouble, it's a natural reaction to blame somebody. Somebody dropped the ball. When we are in a fearful situation, naturally it may be my fault, or it's her fault, or it's his fault, or it's the government's fault, or it's the county's fault, or it's natural to find blame. They were in a storm, and the reason they were in the storm is not because they disobeyed God. The fact is, they obeyed him. He said, let's get into the boat and go to the other side. Because they obeyed him, they found themselves in the midst of a storm. And so I guess what it means then, you can be smack dab in the middle of God's will, and you can be bailing like crazy. You can be smack dab in the middle of God's will and be bailing like crazy. God brings us into situations that trigger fear in order to teach us to apply our faith. There's a saying, sometimes God calms the storm, but sometimes God lets the storm rage and calms his child. In the fearful circumstance that they address as they think of going into the promised land, he gives them this promise to hold on to. When we are in fearful situations, we need something to hold on to. And what he gives us to hold on to are words and promises. Holding on to those promises allows us to root our faith in something. And that's what we find. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. The writer of the letter of Hebrews takes this verse and applies it to a different kind of fear, to a different kind of threat. This is what he says. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, and here's the promise, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? He talks about the love of money, and he says the same promise that was applied in the Old Testament to physical threat. Physical threat feels something like financial threat. They both induce fear. As we look at our bank account, we don't have the resources that we need to allay the fear that comes from what if this happens or what if that happens. It's the same dynamic that it seems the root of the love of money as the root of being afraid in a turbulent storm is fear. And what the verse says, well, keep your lives free from the love of money, be content with what you have, easier said than done. On what basis can we find contentment? Here's the promise, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. The Lord is my banker. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? The word, when it says, never will I leave you, this word in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, this word leave was the word for be still. Let your arms hang limp at your side. In the New Testament, they use a different word. And it has the sense of untying something. I want you to picture you're on the lake and you take, or on a river, let's say maybe that'd be a better illustration. You're on a river and your boat's tied up to the mooring. And the action of leave is if you were to take that halyard that ties it to the mooring and then untie it. And what will happen if you're on a fast-moving river, you untie the boat, what's going to happen to it? It's not going to stay where it is. It's going to be drawn down the current, and then you're in no position to be able to get it. What this verse is saying, God will never do that to you. He will never untie you so you're drifting through life at the whim of fate. He will never do that. That's right. He will never cast you adrift. I will never leave you can be another way to see it. I will never cast you adrift. I will never cast you adrift. There will never be a time where my promises are not connected to you. That's what he says. When it says, never will I forsake you, that to forsake is to leave somebody behind. At the Marines, say in 1883, they took as their motto, Semper Fidelis, Semper Fi, always faithful. And a Marine will be faithful to his comrades and to his country. You could count on them. They would never leave a comrade on the field of battle untended. They would go to and do whatever they needed to do so that that person would never be abandoned. They would never find themselves in this situation where they were alone. And so what God is saying, never will I leave you. I will never cast you adrift. Never will I forsake you. I will never leave you behind. I will never leave you behind. And those are the two promises that he makes. God promises to protect and provide for us when we are threatened. That's the promise. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Be still then, and know that I am God. These promises, the one we looked at last week and this one for this week, if you squeeze them down, be still and know that I am God. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. Those two go together. The thing I like about them is they're in the first person. God making a promise to you. And as you say this promise, be still and know that I am God. And put it with this one. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. Can you memorize that? Be still and know that I am God. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. Putting it that way, as you think about it, it becomes God speaking to you in a time of physical threat or emotional threat or financial threat. And he says, I will never cast you adrift and I will never leave you behind. God promises to protect and provide when we're threatened. And the thing that makes it tricky is God promises to protect and provide, but so does money. And that's what makes it kind of confusing. It says, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. The wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it an unscalable wall. And what it says is the appeal to money is that, and the love of money, we all have to deal with money. And what he's pointing out is that money is inherently seductive. It promises things. Well, what money says is what God says. And what God says, I will never cast you adrift. I will never leave you behind. And money makes the same claim. If you have enough money, you'll always be protected. You'll always be provided for. Money makes the same claim. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. God says, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. In a time of fear, there are two different sources of security. Now, it's not that we're not going to do with money, so what do we do about that? Understand first that these promises are being made and only one can keep it. Ultimately, we're going to have to deal with money. I think Jesus understood the challenge posed by needing to deal with currency. And we do. and financial security is an issue. But Jesus talked about, he says, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your heart. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. Money offers protection, and so does God. And what the Bible would indicate, only one of them is able to keep promises long term. Solomon had this to say in the Proverbs, cast but a glance at riches, and they are gone, for they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle. It used to be a euphemism for being paid. The eagle flies on Friday. That's when I get paid. And what Solomon is saying, the eagle flies on Friday, and he might fly into your bank account, but then he flies off from there as well. Money is something that naturally we have to deal with, but it is not good at keeping long-term problems. In fact, Paul talks about the fact that there is some danger. Some say that money is kind of neutral. Money's neutral in the way that opioids are neutral. When you're in pain, using opioids is indicated in times of extreme pain, and there's something inherently addictive about opioids, so you use them carefully. And so, yeah, but money is like that. It seems to suggest that money is, well, look what it says. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. It promises things. So how do you deal with this? How do you deal with this? Understanding what this is about, it's about a faith issue. And a faith issue is about fear. There's things that are frightening. There's things we're concerned about, things that threaten us. Fear is a natural response to a perceived threat. There's nothing wrong with being afraid. You can't not be afraid. Fear is a natural response to a perceived threat. It all depends, what can we do with it? There's all kinds of sources of help out there. Some are true to their word and some aren't. And what God would say, He is true to His word. And what He says in the context of a frightening thing, let me ask you, I'm not going to, what are you afraid of? I'm not going to ask you to say anything out loud. What are you afraid of? Think about it. Might be physical, might be emotional, might have to do with you, might have to do with your kids, might have to do with your job, might have to do with your parents, might have to do with your future. Is there enough money stacked away? There's fears that come. What do we do with these? We find maybe I can accumulate more, and what God says, stop. Shh. Be still. Know that I am God. I will never leave you or cast you adrift. I will never forsake you and leave you behind. Keeping those words in your mind gives a way to deal with the fear that is at the heart of it. This isn't really about money, and it's not really about threat. It's about fear. And we will be afraid. And when we're afraid, we need something to cling to, something that can calm us. And what God says, in the midst of scary things, you will be afraid. God says, stop. Close the checkbook short term. Don't dial the financial advisor yet. Don't balance the checkbook yet. Stop. And he would say, listen, he has words that you can place your faith in. He says, be still. I am God. I will never leave you. I will never cast you adrift. I will never untie you so that you are going to be at the mercy of fate. I will never do that to you. And I will never forsake you. If you're in a place where you are struggling, I will never abandon you. I will never abandon you. God makes those promises, and he says them because in a time of fear, we need to grab something. Think about what you're afraid of. And what God would say to you, to us, be still. Let go. Cease striving. And know that I am God. Think about what it is that he is God. And that he will never leave or never forsake. The Titanic was known as the unsinkable ship. There were 16 skilled mechanics from Belfast, Ireland, who went down with the ship. An American pastor is the one that led the service in the church to which the 16 members of the Titanic belonged. And his subject of his eulogy and his message was the unsinkable ship. But he wasn't talking about the Titanic. He was talking about this ship. The ship that Jesus was on in the midst of a storm. A ship that couldn't sink because Jesus was on it. Wherever your fearful circumstances, physical, emotional, financial, there are things that threaten us. Here's what he would say. Be still. And know that I am God. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. I'll give you a minute, like we did last week. Put these verses in your head. Very short. Be still and know that I am God. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. You memorize that? If you do, you have something to cling to when threatened. I'll give you a minute and then I'll close us in prayer. Let's stand for closing prayer. God, you don't just tell us to not be afraid. You give us something to cling to at a time, and learning to lean on your words is not something that happens overnight. It's something that we cultivate an ability to do. And the thing that helps us to do that is familiarity with words, promises that you give us. We make room in our minds for these words. Your words are not just informative, they are performative. Your words accomplish the purpose for which you send them. When we make room for your words in our mind, when we are mindful of them, we store them away in our memory so that we can meditate them. Every time we consider those words and we say them to ourselves and we think about them, the root of our faith goes a little bit deeper into them. It's not overnight. It's a long-term thing. I'd ask that these verses might become firmly rooted in our consciousness so that we could grab them in times when we're afraid. Be still and know that I am God. Never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. In Jesus' name, amen.